Story number 1. The 3 a.m. subway screams. New York, 1999. It was the winter of 1999 when I started working the graveyard shift at a printing press in downtown Manhattan. The pay wasn't great, but it covered rent, and I needed that job. Every night, I took the subway home around 3 a.m., boarding the nearly empty train from 14th Street. The city never truly slept, but the subway at that hour felt different, like something was watching. From the dark corners, just out of sight. That night, I was exhausted. My fingers ached from handling paper stacks all evening, and my back was sore from bending over the machines. I just wanted to get home, shower, and pass out in my tiny apartment. When I reached the platform, only a few stragglers stood around. A homeless man mumbling to himself in a corner, a woman with headphones bobbing her head to music, and a guy in a trench coat leaning against a pillar, staring at nothing. The train screeched into the station, and the doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. I stepped inside and took my usual seat near the door. The woman with the headphones sat across from me, and the homeless man stayed back near the corner. The guy in the trench coat didn't get on. The doors closed, and the train rumbled forward into the tunnels. For the first few minutes, everything was normal. Just the soft hum of the train and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks. Then the lights flickered. That wasn't unusual. The subway system was old, and these things happened all the time. But when they came back on, the woman with the headphones was gone. I blinked. She had been right there. I hadn't heard her get up, hadn't seen her move. The homeless man was still in his corner, head down. My skin prickled, but I told myself she must have just switched cars quietly. I died, Miss, because I was too tired. The train continued. The next stop should have been West 4th Street. But the announcement never came. The train didn't slow down. It kept going. The digital sign that displayed the station names was glitched, flashing random symbols and broken letters. My pulse quickened. I checked my watch. 3:07 a.m. We should have reached the next stop by now. The air in the car felt heavy, thick, with something I couldn't name. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, and the overhead vents blew air that smelled faintly of mildew. I turned to the homeless man, the only other person in the car. "Hey," I called, keeping my voice steady. "Do you know what's going on?" He didn't look up. I stood and took a step toward him. "Mister, are you okay?" Still nothing. I reached out, ready to shake his shoulder. His head snapped up, and I stumbled back. His eyes were wrong. Too wide, too white. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing gums blackened as if rotting from the inside. "Don't turn around," he rasped. My stomach twisted. I hadn't turned around, but now every nerve in my body screamed at me not to. I stared at him. He started laughing, low and wet, as if something was gurgling in his throat. Then he slumped forward, completely still. The train kept moving. I felt it before I saw it. A presence behind me. The weight of unseen eyes boring into the back of my skull. The kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl before your brain can even process why. The homeless man's warning echoed in my ears. I gripped the cold metal pole beside me, knuckles turning white. My breath was shallow, too fast. My feet refused to move. The urge to turn around was unbearable, like an itch deep inside my bones. And then a whisper, right behind me. So close, I could feel the breath against my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around. The train car was empty. My chest heaved, heart pounding against my ribs. The doors at the far end of the car stood open, leading to the next compartment. A cold draft slipped through, carrying the scent of damp concrete and something metallic. I knew I had two choices: stay and wait for whatever was happening to unfold, or move. I stepped forward, gripping the handrails as I made my way to the next car. The moment I crossed the threshold, the doors behind me slammed shut with a deafening clang. This car was identical to the last. Same plastic seats, same buzzing lights, except for one thing. The woman with the headphones was sitting there again, right where she had been before, but her head was down, and her headphones were gone. Her hands rested in her lap, palms up, as if waiting for something. Her nails were blackened, like the homeless man's gums. Slowly, her head lifted, her eyes white, hollow. A smile stretched across her face, too wide for her features. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. The train screeched violently, throwing me to the floor. Lights flickered, and a guttural, distorted noise filled the car, like a recording of a scream played backward. The windows went black, as if something outside was pressing against the glass, suffocating the light. I scrambled to my feet, heart slamming against my ribs. I had to get off this train. The digital display above the door flickered, and for the first time since this nightmare began, words appeared. Next stop, home. I didn't want to know what that meant. The train jolted again, and I stumbled toward the door, hitting the emergency stop button repeatedly. Nothing. The woman stood up, her body twitched, joints cracking unnaturally as she took a step toward me. I ran. I didn't look back. I shoved through the next door, then the next. The cars stretched endlessly, identical copies of each other. My lungs burned. I kept going. Then I saw it. The red emergency lever near the conductor's cabin. I lunged for it, yanking it down with every ounce of strength I had left. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the train groaned, metal screeching against metal. My body lurched forward as it came to a violent halt. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The air was still. The doors hissed open. I didn't hesitate. I bolted onto the platform. The moment my feet hit solid ground, the train doors slammed shut behind me. I turned, gasping for breath. The windows were dark. The train was empty. No homeless man, no woman, just me. And then the train pulled away. As it vanished into the tunnel, the lights inside flickered one last time. For the briefest moment, I saw them, their white eyes, their twisted grins, watching me. I never took the subway again. Story number 2, The Abandoned Carnival of Houston, Texas, 1987. The summer of 1987 was hotter than hell, the kind of heat that made the pavement shimmer and turned Houston into an open-air oven. We were kids back then. Me, Johnny, Chris, and David. Restless and always looking for trouble. The abandoned carnival on the east side of town was the kind of place that dared us to be stupid. It had shut down years ago after a fire gutted half the attractions. The owners packed up what they could and vanished, leaving behind rusted rides, broken booths, and a Ferris wheel that still stood like a dead giant against the sky. The rumors about that place were endless. Stories of people disappearing, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. But we were 16, and fear was just another game to us. One night we decided to break in. We met up behind David's house just after midnight, armed with flashlights, cigarettes, and a couple of stolen beers. We rode our bikes through the empty streets, stopping just outside the rusted chain-link fence. that surrounded the carnival grounds. The padlock on the gate was long gone, the entrance hanging open like an invitation. The second we stepped inside, the air changed. It wasn't just the stillness, it was the smell, stale, like burnt wood, and something rotting underneath. The ride stood frozen in time, covered in vines and dust. The carousel was missing most of its horses, the few remaining ones tilted at odd angles, their painted faces cracked and peeling. Chris whistled. "Man, this place is creepy as hell." Johnny laughed. "What are you scared?" Chris flipped him off, but I could tell he was uneasy. So was I. Something about this place made my stomach twist, but we weren't about to back out now. We wandered deeper, past the remnants of old food stands, their signs faded and unreadable. The prize booths still had dusty stuffed animals hanging from their pegs, their button eyes staring down at us. Then we reached the main attraction, the fun house. It was the only structure still mostly intact. Its faded red and yellow paint was peeling, and the entrance was a gaping black hole. The words "Laughing Land" were barely visible above the doorway. The clown face painted around the entrance had been warped by the fire. Its grin stretched too wide, its eyes hollow and cracked. "Bet none of you have the balls to go inside," Johnny said. David snorted. "Bet you won't go first." Johnny grinned and stepped forward. "Watch me." We followed him in. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked beneath our feet. The mirrors in the hall of reflections were shattered, jagged pieces glinting under our flashlights. The walls were warped from the heat of the old fire, curling inward like they were trying to swallow us whole. Then we heard it. Laughter. Low, distant, but definitely there. My stomach turned to ice. "Did you hear that?" Chris nodded, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "Tell me that was one of you." Nobody answered. We pressed forward, our footsteps cautious now. The deeper we went, the more warped the funhouse became. The corridors twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Some doors led to nowhere. Others opened into rooms that shouldn't exist. My skin prickled. It felt like the building itself was alive, shifting while we walked. Then Johnny screamed. We turned and saw him standing in front of a broken mirror, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "There's someone in here," he gasped. I stepped closer, shining my light on the glass. My reflection stared back at me. So did Johnny's. But there was something else, something standing behind him. A figure, tall, wrong. Its face was stretched too long, too thin, like it had been melted and pulled back into place. Its grin was wide, too wide, reaching from cheek to cheek. And its eyes, black pits that seemed to go on forever, were locked onto Johnny. "Run," I whispered. But Johnny didn't move. His breath came out in quick, panicked gasps. Then the mirror shattered. Glass rained down around us, and Johnny screamed as something yanked him backward into the darkness. We ran. Chris and David were ahead of me. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at Johnny, at where he had been. The space behind the mirror was a black void, swallowing his cries, as if he had never been there at all. We tore through the funhouse, the walls groaning around us, the laughter growing louder, wild and distorted. The exits we came through were gone. Every hallway twisted into another, leading us deeper. Then I saw it, a door, a real door. I slammed into it, throwing my weight against the wood. It burst open, and suddenly we were outside, tumbling onto the cold dirt. The night air hit my lungs like ice. Chris and David were beside me, gasping, wide-eyed. But Johnny wasn't there. The funhouse loomed behind us, silent. The laughter had stopped. The door we had come through was gone, It was just a wall now, solid and unbroken. We sat there for what felt like hours, staring, waiting. But Johnny never came out. The police didn't believe us. They searched the carnival the next day, but there was no sign of him. They found his bike outside the fence, his flashlight near the entrance, but that was it. No footprints, no clothes, nothing. It was like he had never been there. They told his parents he must have run away. But we knew better. I tried to go back once, years later. In 1995. The carnival had been demolished. Nothing left but an empty lot. But even now, when I drive past, I swear I can hear it. The laughter. Some nights I hear it in my dreams. And sometimes, only sometimes, I swear I see Johnny, standing in the mirror, still grinning. Story number 3. The Boy Who Walked Backwards. New Orleans, 1975. The first time I noticed something was wrong with my son, he was standing in the hallway outside my bedroom at 3 a.m. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The room was dark, and I was barely awake. But when my eyes adjusted, I saw him, Daniel, my 6-year-old boy, standing there, completely still. The light from the bathroom behind him stretched his shadow long across the floor. "Danny," I mumbled, sitting up. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" He didn't answer. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, rubbing my eyes. My heart pounded with a strange unease, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way he was standing, rigid, arms limp at his sides, head tilted slightly forward. I walked toward him, but before I could reach him, he turned. Not like a normal person, he didn't pivot or shift his weight. He just moved. His feet stayed planted, but his body twisted smoothly until he was facing away from me. And then, without a sound, he walked backward down the hallway. A cold shiver ran through me as I watched him disappear into the dark. I followed, flicking on the lights as I went. "Danny?" When I reached his bedroom, he was in bed, tucked under his blanket, breathing softly. He looked like he'd been sleeping for hours. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of his breath. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was still half asleep and my mind had played tricks on me. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I didn't mention it. I watched him closely over breakfast, but he seemed normal. Laughing, eating his cereal, swinging his little legs under the table. I almost convinced myself it had never happened until I saw him do it again. It was a week later. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, when I saw him through the window, playing in the backyard. The sun had just started setting, casting an orange glow over the grass. He was standing near the big oak tree, facing away from the house. And then he started walking backwards, not stumbling, not feeling his way, just moving smoothly, as if he could see exactly where he was going. He took careful steps, his arms loose at his sides, his head slightly tilted forward. "Danny," I called, stepping outside. He stopped. For a moment, he stood perfectly still. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned around, grinned at me, and ran toward the porch. "Yeah, Mama?" he asked, breathless. I forced a smile. "You okay, baby?" He nodded, looking at me like I was the one acting strange. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed the way he had moved, the eerie smoothness of it. I told myself I was overreacting. Kids were weird, sometimes. Maybe he'd picked up some new habit from a friend at school. But then, things got worse. He started whispering to the walls. At first, I thought he was just talking to himself, the way kids do. but I'd find him standing in the hallway, eyes wide and glassy, murmuring in a voice too low to understand. Sometimes I'd catch a word, soon, or she's listening, or not yet. When I asked him who he was talking to, he'd just smile and say, "No one, Mama." Then, one night, I woke up to a soft creaking noise. I sat up, heart pounding. It was coming from the hallway. I got out of bed, creeping toward the door. When I peeked out, I saw him, walking backward. He moved slowly, step by step, his bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. His head was tilted forward again, his chin nearly touching his chest. His arms dangled at his sides. I swallowed, my mouth dry. "Danny?" He stopped. Slowly, his head turned toward me, but only his head. His body stayed completely still. His eyes were open too wide. His mouth curved up at the edges, just slightly. Then he whispered something. I didn't hear it. Or maybe I did, but my mind refused to understand. "Baby," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Let's go back to bed, okay?" For a long time, he didn't move. Then, in one slow, fluid motion, he turned fully toward me and smiled. "Okay, Mama." He walked past me, normally this time, and climbed into bed. I stood there for a long time, staring at his small body, curled under the blanket. Something was wrong. I called the doctor the next morning. The pediatrician told me kids had phases, that sometimes they developed strange habits. He said as long as Danny was eating, sleeping, and acting fine, otherwise, there was no need to worry. But I was worried. Then one night, I woke up to whispering, not from Danny's room, from inside my own. My heart stopped. The whispers were coming from the corner, just beyond the reach of the moonlight spilling through the window. I reached for the lamp, my fingers shaking. I turned it on. Danny was standing in the corner of my room, facing the wall. His back was to me. I sat frozen, gripping the sheets. "Danny?" He didn't respond. I slowly got out of bed. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Then he moved, not turning, not walking, just moving. His body slid backward, his feet barely lifting, as if something unseen was pulling him toward me. I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. His head tilted forward, his chin pressing against his chest. His breathing was slow, too slow. I swallowed, my voice shaking. "Baby, let's go back to bed." He stopped. Then, in that same low whisper, he said, "She's almost here." The room went silent. A chill spread over my skin, the air thick and heavy. Then Danny blinked. For a second he looked normal, sleepy, confused. He rubbed his eyes and yawned. "Mama," he murmured, "why are you up?" My throat tightened. I forced a smile. "Bad dream, baby. Come on, let's get you to bed." He nodded and let me tuck him in. That was the last time I saw him sleep in his bed. The next morning, he was gone. The police searched for weeks. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished. But I knew, because sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear him, walking backwards in the dark. Story number 4. The Shadow in the Motel Mirror, Nevada, 2022. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, a dark ribbon cutting through the Nevada desert. My eyes burned from driving too long, and the radio had long since lost reception. The last gas station was miles back, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I checked my phone. No signal. Figures. This stretch of highway was known for being desolate. I had been on the road for hours, trying to outrun my thoughts. I had just gone through a messy breakup, left behind an apartment filled with bad memories, and packed my life into a couple of bags. I wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just away. The neon glow of a sign flickered in the distance. Silver Crest Motel. It looked like the kind of place where the sheets smelled like cigarettes and the vending machines ate your money, but at that point, I was too exhausted to care. I pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine. The air outside was still and dry, the kind of quiet that made my skin prickle. The motel office had a buzzing fluorescent light above the door, and the vacancy sign blinked erratically. Inside, an old man sat behind the counter, his eyes flicking up from a tiny television playing static. "Room for the night?" I asked, pulling out my wallet. He nodded slowly, sliding over a key attached to a bulky plastic tag. "Room 12, he said, in a voice that sounded like gravel. "No refunds." I forced a smile. Wasn't planning on needing one. His eyes lingered on me for a second longer than I liked. Then he went back to staring at the static. I stepped back outside, the air eerily silent. The motel was a single-story strip of rooms, their paint peeling under the relentless desert sun. I found my door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The room was exactly what I expected. Stained carpet, a flickering bedside lamp, and the faint scent of mildew. A bed, a small TV, a rickety desk, and of course a mirror, a huge one covering almost the entire wall across from the bed. Old motels loved those oversized mirrors, probably to make the rooms feel bigger. This one was cracked in the top corner. I tossed my bag onto the bed and went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face. When I looked up into the mirror above the sink, something felt off. My reflection was normal. Same tired eyes, same mess of dark hair. But something in the other room looked wrong. I turned my head slightly, looking past my own reflection into the main room where the large mirror reflected everything back. The lamp flickered. For a second, just a split second, there was something else in the reflection. A shape, dark and hunched, standing near the bed. I whipped around. Nothing. Just the empty room. I let out a slow breath, rubbing my face. "You're tired," I muttered to myself. "Your brain is playing tricks." Still, when I left the bathroom, I avoided looking at the big mirror. I turned on the TV, but the only thing it picked up was static. I left it on anyway. Something about the faint hum of white noise felt better than silence. I lay down, the mattress stiff as a board. The room felt colder than it should have. I pulled the blanket up and closed my eyes. A sound. A slow, dragging sound. My body went rigid. I cracked one eye open, staring at the ceiling. The sound came again, like something heavy shifting across the carpet. I turned my head slightly. The mirror. In the dim light, I could see my reflection lying in bed, exactly as I was. But the reflection wasn't alone. There was something standing at the foot of the bed in the mirror. My throat closed up. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body stretching in unnatural angles, its head tilted just slightly. No features, just a shifting darkness. It stood motionless, but I swear I could feel it breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. I counted to 5. When I opened them, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep. Morning came, and the desert sun flooded the room with an unforgiving brightness. I sat up, slowly, my body stiff. My first instinct was to check the mirror, but I hesitated. What if it was still there? I forced myself to look. Just my reflection. Nothing else. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Because when I looked closer, I realized something that made my stomach twist. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I scrambled out of bed, my pulse hammering. And the moment I looked away, I felt something shift in the room. I grabbed my bag, not even bothering to zip it, and bolted for the door. The old man at the front desk barely looked up when I threw the key onto the counter. "Something wrong?" he asked, voice dry. "That mirror," I started, but I couldn't finish the sentence. What was I supposed to say? That my reflection had a mind of its own? He sighed as if he'd heard this before. "You weren't supposed to look." I stared at him, my skin crawling. "What the hell does that mean, I asked just turned his gaze back to the static on the TV. I got in my car and drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I was miles away. For days after, I avoided mirrors. I kept them covered, used my phone camera when I needed to check my reflection. But eventually, I convinced myself it had been exhaustion, my brain conjuring shadows that weren't there. Then, a week later, I caught my reflection, doing something it shouldn't have. I had been brushing my teeth in my new apartment, the events of that night already starting to fade into a bad memory. I spit into the sink, rinsed my mouth, and straightened up. And then I saw it. My reflection wasn't brushing its teeth. It was staring at me, grinning. I haven't looked in a mirror since. Story number 5. The Dead Don't Dial. Chicago, 2001. The first call came at 11:47 p.m. I remember the time exactly because I had been staring at the glowing red numbers on my alarm clock, trying to will myself to sleep. It had been a long week. Too much work, not enough sleep, and way too much thinking about things I couldn't change. When my phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. No one called me that late. I hesitated before reaching for it, half expecting bad news. Maybe something had happened to my parents. Maybe my sister needed something. Maybe I checked the caller ID. It was a number I knew by heart. Derek's number. My stomach twisted. I dropped the phone onto the bed like it had burned me. My breath came short. My fingers curled into the sheets. Derek had been dead for 3 weeks. I just sat there, staring at the screen, my brain unable to process what I was looking at. It was impossible. A glitch, maybe. A telemarketer using a random number generator. The phone stopped ringing. I told myself not to panic. It had to be some mix-up, some mistake in the system. I grabbed the phone, hesitated, then did what I shouldn't have. I called the number back. It rang once, twice, then static. Soft at first, barely a whisper in my ear. Then louder, crackling, like a bad radio signal. I held my breath, pressing the phone tighter against my ear, trying to make sense of it. And then, beneath the static, a voice, faint, distant. "Amy." I felt ice crawl down my spine. It was him. It was Derek. His voice was warped, barely more than a whisper. But I knew it. I knew it. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, my mind scrambling for logic. This wasn't real. He was gone. I had been at the funeral. I'd seen his body in the casket, pale and still. This couldn't be happening. The static deepened, and his voice came again. "Amy, please." My breath hitched. Then the line went dead. I sat in silence, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. My heart pounded in my ears. I should have turned the phone off. I should have thrown it across the room and pretended it never happened. Instead, I stayed up all night, staring at the screen, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. The next morning, I barely made it through work. My boss snapped at me twice for zoning out, and I spilled coffee all over my desk. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? That night, I left my phone on the kitchen counter and forced myself to sleep. But at 11:47 p.m., it rang again. I sat bolt upright, my skin damp with sweat. I could hear it from the other room, vibrating against the counter. I didn't move. It rang and rang and stopped. I squeezed my eyes shut. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. Then the voicemail alert beeped. I should have ignored it. But my hand moved on its own, picking up the phone, pressing play. Static. Then I don't know where I am. My breath caught in my throat. Derek's voice, small and lost, as if he were calling from somewhere far away. I gripped the phone tighter. Derek, I whispered, knowing he couldn't hear me. The static crackled, swallowing the rest of the message. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, picked up groceries, even went out with friends. I laughed in the right places, nodded at the right times, but my mind was somewhere else, waiting. That night, I didn't bother leaving my phone in the kitchen. I sat up in bed, staring at it. At 11:47 p.m., it rang. I answered. The static was thicker this time, suffocating. I pressed the phone so tight against my ear it hurt. Amy. His voice was clearer now. My throat tightened. Derek? A pause, then, I'm lost. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? Where are you? The static rose, but I could hear him breathing. Dark, he murmured. It's so dark. A lump formed in my throat. My hands clenched into fists. Derek, this can't be real. A soft crackling noise, almost like laughter, but it was wrong. Then, his voice, shaking. It's coming. The line went dead. I sat frozen, the phone pressed against my ear long after the call had ended. I tried to tell myself it was stress, grief, a trick of my exhausted mind. But the next night the call came again, and the next. Every night, the same time. His voice growing fainter, more desperate. He was trapped, somewhere, and something was with him. By the fifth night, I was barely functioning. My hands trembled constantly, and I jumped at the smallest noises. That night, I answered before it could even ring. Twice. Derek, I whispered. Static. Then his voice, raw and weak. Amy, what's happening? Tell me how to help you. A long silence, then, you can't. My heart clenched. Then, in a voice so low I almost didn't catch it, I shouldn't have answered. A pause, then a click, and then the worst sound I've ever heard. Something else breathing into the phone. Slow, deep. Not Derek. The call cut off. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. My chest rose and fell in ragged gasps. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to Derek's grave. The cemetery was empty, the sky overcast, the wind cutting through my jacket. I stood in front of his headstone, my hands clenched at my sides. I don't know what's happening, I whispered, but if you can hear me, I love you, Derek. The wind shifted, brushing against my cheek like a cold breath. That night, I turned my phone off for the first time in years. It didn't ring. I haven't turned it back on since, and I never will. Story number 6, The Drowned Girl of Miami Beach, Florida, 1993. The day I moved into the apartment on Miami Beach, I felt like I had finally made it. The ocean was just a few steps away. The breeze smelled like salt and sun, and for the first time in my life, I had a place that was truly my own. It was a small studio, nothing fancy, just a bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a balcony that overlooked the water. The building was old, the kind of place tourists ignored, but I didn't care. It was mine. After years of struggling, of fighting to be seen, of clawing my way through life as a trans woman in a world that didn't always want me, I had found my peace. At least that's what I thought. The first night, I slept with the windows open, listening to the distant crash of waves. The sound was soothing, steady, like the ocean was breathing. I drifted off easily, exhaustion from the move pulling me under. Then, just before dawn, I woke up to the sound of dripping water. At first I thought it was the sink. I got up, my feet cold against the tile, and checked the faucet. Dry. The shower too. But the sound continued. Slow, rhythmic drips coming from somewhere inside the apartment. Then I saw it. The mirror. A thin line of water trickled down its surface, as if someone had just stepped out of the shower and pressed their wet hands against it. But I was alone. I touched the glass. It was ice cold. A shiver ran through me. I wiped the water away with my sleeve and told myself it was nothing. Condensation from the humidity, maybe. The building was old. Things leaked. But the next night, it happened again. I woke up at exactly the same time, 3:42 a.m. The air in the apartment felt thick, heavy, like walking through water. I turned on the light, my heart thudding. The mirror was wet again. This time, there were fingerprints, long, slender fingers streaked down the glass. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move closer. My own reflection stared back at me, pale and uncertain. Then, just for a second, something moved behind me. A shape. A girl. I spun around, so fast, I nearly lost my balance. The apartment was empty. I didn't sleep after that. By the third night, I was terrified to turn off the lights. I sat up in bed, watching the mirror, my breath shallow. At exactly 3:42 a.m., the air shifted. I felt it before I saw it. Something wet, something cold pressing against my skin. The mirror fogged over as if someone was breathing on the other side. Then slowly words began to appear. Help me. My stomach twisted, my hands clenched into fists. I didn't run, I should have, but something inside me, something deep, kept me frozen. The air grew colder. Then behind me, the sound of dripping water. Turned my head, and my breath caught in my throat. She was standing in the bathroom doorway, barefoot, soaking wet. Her dark hair hung in tangled, heavy strands over her face, her skin tinged blue like the drowned. Her dress clung to her, dripping water onto the floor. She shouldn't have been there. She wasn't there. But she was. I forced my voice to work. Who are you? She didn't speak, just stared. Then she stepped closer. My entire body went rigid, my breath coming in sharp gasps. She raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the balcony. Then, in a voice like the tide pulling back, she whispered, "He's still there." A blast of cold air rushed past me. The lamp flickered, and then she was gone. I didn't move for a long time. My body was shaking so badly I could barely breathe. The floor where she had stood was still wet. I didn't sleep. Instead, as soon as the sun came up, I went downstairs and asked the building manager about my apartment. The old man behind the desk barely looked up from his newspaper. "That room's been empty for a long time," he said. "Nobody stayed there since..." He trailed off. I leaned in. "Since what?" He exhaled through his nose. "A couple years back, a girl drowned. Wasn't from here, just visiting. They found her floating right outside the balcony." A chill ran through me. "How?" He shrugged. "Nobody knows. Some say she jumped. Some say she was pushed." I licked my lips. "And the man she mentioned?" His eyes flicked up then, sharp and wary. "What man?" I didn't answer. That night I sat on the balcony staring at the ocean. The moon was high, turning the waves silver. The air was thick with salt and something else, something wrong. At exactly 3:42 a.m., the wind shifted. A shadow moved near the water. Not hers. A man, standing ankle deep in the waves, staring up at me. I couldn't see his face, but I felt him watching. I gripped the railing, my pulse hammering. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed, straight at me. My breath caught. The wind roared around me, and suddenly I couldn't move. My feet wouldn't obey. My hands clenched so tight around the metal railing that my knuckles turned white. Then, a whisper, right against my ear. "Run." A force slammed into me, breaking whatever held me in place. I stumbled backward, gasping. The wind stopped. The beach below was empty. I never stayed in that apartment again. By morning, I had packed my bags and left the keys on the counter. I don't know who she was. I don't know who he was. But I know one thing. She wasn't the one I should have been afraid of. Story number 7. The 7th floor doesn't exist. Los Angeles, 2018. The hotel was old, but it had been renovated so many times that the history of the place was buried beneath new wallpaper and cheap carpeting. I had checked in late after a delayed flight, too tired to care about much beyond getting to my room. The receptionist was barely awake herself, tapping at the keyboard with half-lidded eyes before sliding a key card across the counter. "Room 743, she mumbled. I took the card and slung my bag over my shoulder. As I walked away, she called out, almost like an afterthought, "Don't press the button for the 7th floor." I turned back, but she had already gone back to staring at her screen. Her words stuck with me as I stepped into the elevator, the doors gliding shut with a dull chime. I stared at the panel of buttons, my finger hovering over the number 7. Don't press it. Why? A joke? Maybe? Some weird inside reference the hotel staff shared? Shrugging it off, I pressed 7 out of pure curiosity. The elevator hummed as it ascended, smooth and quiet. But when it reached the 7th floor, it didn't stop. No chime, no pause, just darkness. The lights overhead flickered, and for a split second the display panel glitched, showing symbols instead of numbers. Then the elevator kept going. By the time it reached the 14th floor, I had convinced myself it was just a wiring issue. Maybe the 7th floor had been turned into a maintenance level, or maybe it didn't exist at all. Some buildings skip numbers, right? Still, the back of my neck prickled as I stepped into the hallway and found my room. The night was quiet. Too quiet. I had expected the usual hum of hotel life. Muffled voices, the distant rumble of ice machines, doors closing down the hall. But there was nothing. At some point, I drifted off. Then the knocking started. A slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The sound had come from the wall behind the bed, the room next to mine. I checked the time. 3:14 a.m. I lay still, waiting. Another knock. 3 times, measured and precise. I sat up, throat dry. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I got up and moved toward the door, pressing my ear against the wall. Nothing. Just a thick, suffocating silence. Then a whisper, not from the wall, from inside the room. I spun around, every muscle in my body locking up. The whispering was low, too soft to make out, but it was there. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swept it around the room. Nothing. The whispering stopped. The air felt wrong. Too heavy. Thick with something I couldn't name. I checked the closet. Empty. The bathroom. Empty. Under the bed. Empty. My pulse slowed. Maybe I had imagined it. The exhaustion, the late flight. It was getting to me. I climbed back into bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knocking to start again. It didn't. But something else did. The air changed. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. My ears popped, the pressure shifting. And then the door handle turned. Not a knock, not a jiggle, a slow, deliberate turn. I stared, frozen in place. The handle twisted all the way down, then released. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then the worst part. The electronic lock beeped, like someone had just scanned a key card. The door clicked open an inch. I shot up, fumbling for the lamp. The second light flooded the room. The door slammed shut. I ran to it, locked it, and stepped back. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I wanted to call the front desk, demand to know who had tried to enter my room, but my hands were shaking too badly to even dial. Then I saw the key card. Not mine. Lying in the middle of the floor, where the door had opened. It was blank. I grabbed my things. I didn't care what time it was. Didn't care that I had nowhere else to go. I was not staying another minute. I threw my bag over my shoulder and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. I rushed to the elevator, stabbing the button. The doors slid open immediately, and I stepped inside, hitting the lobby button over and over. The doors started to close, then stopped. The elevator didn't move. The overhead lights flickered. Then the button started changing. Every number disappeared. Then slowly, a single number appeared. The elevator began to descend. I hit the buttons frantically. Lobby. Open doors. Nothing worked. The floor display ticked down. 12th, 11th, 10th. Faster. Then, the doors opened. 7th floor. My stomach turned to ice. The hallway was dark. Not dim. Pitch black. The kind of black that swallowed light whole. The air was cold, damp, like standing near an open freezer. And then, footsteps, slow, dragging, coming closer. I stabbed the close door button. The footsteps quickened. My breath caught in my throat. Then, a hand. Pale, thin fingers curled around the elevator door, stopping it from closing. And then a face, no eyes, just smooth, empty skin. It smiled. The doors slammed shut. The elevator rocketed down. I hit the lobby button over and over, whispering, please, please, please. The elevator stopped. The doors slid open. Lobby. Bright, warm, light. I ran. The receptionist barely glanced up as I sprinted past the counter, breathless, shaking. I didn't stop until I was outside. The warm Los Angeles air, thick around me. I kept walking, didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached a different hotel miles away. I never went back for my things. The hotel called me the next day, saying housekeeping found my room empty. Everything untouched, except for one thing, a single key card with no number on it. Story number 8, the ice cream truck that came at midnight. Detroit, 1982. It started on the hottest night of the summer. Detroit, 1982. I was 10 years old, and my world was small, our little neighborhood. My best friend Joey, the beat-up bikes we rode until the streetlights came on. That night, the air was thick and still, the kind of heat that made sleep impossible. I lay in bed, my sheets kicked to the floor. staring at the ceiling, waiting for a breeze that wouldn't come. Then I heard it, the jingle, faint at first, drifting in through my open window, but unmistakable, the kind of melody that sent kids sprinting out of their houses with sweaty dollar bills in hand. But it was midnight. Ice cream trucks didn't come at midnight. I sat up, heart thudding. The music was getting closer, tinny and warped, like an old music box winding down. I crept to my window and peered outside. The truck rolled slowly down our street, its headlights dim, almost flickering. It was old too, paint chipping. The decals faded to ghostly outlines. The words, "Frosty Treats," were barely visible on the side. And then I saw the driver. He sat stiffly behind the wheel, his face obscured by the shadows. The truck came to a stop near the corner, right under the street lamp. The music stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the back window slid open with a soft creak. I expected to hear a voice, the usual sing-song call of, "Come get your ice cream." But there was only silence. Then, movement. A figure stepped into view behind the counter. Not the driver. A girl. She couldn't have been much older than me, but something about her was wrong. Her skin was too pale, her dress tattered and damp like she'd been caught in the rain. Her dark hair clung to her face in tangled clumps, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto mine. I ducked back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a sound drifted up from the street. A voice, software, sweet, almost melodic. "Come outside." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up. This was a dream. It had to be. Then another voice. From the house next door. "Joey." I snapped my eyes open just as he stepped onto his front porch, rubbing his eyes, his pajama shirt hanging loose on one shoulder. The girl in the truck smiled. I wanted to scream for him to stop, to get back inside, but my voice was gone, buried under a suffocating weight of fear. Joey walked toward the truck, one slow step at a time. The girl reached down behind the counter, her pale fingers disappearing into the shadows. She lifted something, an ice cream cone, vanilla, perfectly swirled, the kind we'd always begged our parents for. She held it out to him. Joey hesitated. Then he reached for it. The second his fingers touched the cone, the truck's engine rumbled to life. The music started again, but now it was warped, wrong, a slowed-down version of itself. The girl's smile widened, too wide. Joey's body stiffened, and then he disappeared. Not snatched, not pulled, just gone, like he had never been there at all. The truck's back window slid shut. The headlights flickered, and then it began to move, rolling down the street, the jingle growing fainter until the night swallowed it completely. Joey's front door still hung open, the porch light flickering. I stared at the empty street, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The next morning, Joey's mom was outside, calling for him, panic rising in her voice. She knocked on doors, checked the backyard, the basement, the shed. But there was nothing, no footprints, no signs of him anywhere. The police came. They searched, questioned neighbors. I told them what I had seen, the truck, the girl, the ice cream. They didn't believe me. "Kids don't just disappear," they said. But Joey did. And I never saw him again. I stopped sleeping with my window open after that. Summer ended. The leaves turned. Life went on. But some nights, hot, windless nights when the air feels too thick to breathe, I still hear it, that distant warp jingle, growing closer. Story number 9. The Barn That Swallowed People, Kansas, 1966. The first time I saw the barn eat someone, I was 10 years old. It was a cold autumn evening in 1966, and my older brother Tom had dared me to sneak out to the old barn at the edge of our property. It had been there long before our family bought the land, standing like a forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere, its red paint long faded to a dull rust. My parents warned us to stay away from it. See, it was unsafe, but that only made us more curious. Tom and his best friend Charlie had been whispering about it for weeks, telling stories of animals that wandered inside and never came out. No bones, no tracks, just gone. Charlie swore his uncle had told him a farmhand went missing there back in the 30s, but nobody believed him. People left town all the time back then. That night, the three of us stood in the field, staring at the barn. The wind had died down, and the sky was a deep purple, the last traces of daylight bleeding into the horizon. "You gonna chicken out?" Tom smirked, nudging me. I didn't answer. My hands were balled into fists at my sides. Charlie grinned. "Only one way to prove it's just a normal barn." He pulled a flashlight from his jacket and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the dark. He stepped forward first, Tom right behind him. I hesitated, my gut twisting with something I didn't have a name for. The barn felt wrong. Even from a distance, the air around it seemed heavier, like the world was pressing in closer the nearer we got. But I followed. The doors groaned as Tom pushed them open, revealing a gaping darkness inside. Dust floated in the beam of the flashlight, swirling like tiny ghosts. The air smelled of damp wood and something else, something stale and rotten, like the scent of a dead animal long after the flies had left. Charlie stepped inside first. "See?" he called back. "Just a barn." Tom followed, glancing back at me. "You coming or what?" I swallowed hard and took a step in. The second my foot crossed the threshold, the wind howled, and the doors slammed shut behind us. We all froze. Charlie swung the flashlight toward the entrance. The doors were shut tight, but there was no latch, no lock, just heavy wood that had moved on its own. "Okay," Tom muttered. That was weird. Charlie laughed, but it was forced. "Wind, man, just the wind." But there was no wind, not inside, not outside. The air was dead. The flashlight flickered. Charlie smacked it against his palm. "Come on." The beam cut out, and the barn swallowed us whole. The dark was instant, absolute. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The silence was worse, stretching like a living thing, thick and heavy. Then I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing. Something deeper, a shifting, like the walls themselves were moving. Tom grabbed my arm. "Charlie?" No answer. I reached blindly, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric of Charlie's jacket. "We have to go," I whispered. Charlie didn't move. "Charlie?" I shook him, harder this time. He felt stiff, rigid, wrong, and then he was gone. I didn't feel him leave. Didn't hear him run. He was just gone, like he had never been standing there at all. Tom yanked me backward. "What the hell was that?" His voice was tight, panicked. I couldn't speak. My throat was too dry, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then the flashlight flickered back on. Charlie was gone. Not on the ground, not near the door, just not there. The barn was empty. The air pressed against us, thick and suffocating. The walls groaned, and then a whisper, low, deep, not words, just sound. I turned toward it, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The flashlight beam swept over the wooden walls. the hay-covered floor, and then I saw it. The wood was breathing. The walls moved in slow, steady pulses like lungs expanding and contracting. The boards twisted and flexed, shifting like muscle beneath skin. And then the floor shuddered. Tom grabbed my wrist. "We're getting out of here." We ran. The doors didn't budge. We slammed against them, kicking, pounding, screaming. Something creaked behind us. Tom turned the flashlight toward the center of the barn, and we saw it. A hole. Not just a hole. A gaping, yawning wound in the ground, like the earth had split open. It hadn't been there before. It pulsed. The boards around it curled inward, bending and warping, pulling downward like a mouth trying to close. And then I saw something else. Charlie's flashlight, lying near the edge. But no Charlie. Tom swore under his breath. He turned back to the door, throwing his entire weight against it. The barn groaned. Then, suddenly, light. The doors burst open, spilling moonlight inside. We didn't hesitate. We ran, tripping over ourselves as we scrambled out into the night. The second my feet hit the dirt, I collapsed, gasping for air. The wind had returned, whistling through the fields, rustling the trees. Tom stood beside me, shaking. We looked back at the barn. The doors were shut again. No hole, no movement, just a barn. We never found Charlie. The police searched for weeks. They questioned us, asked us to tell the story over and over. But in the end, they ruled it a disappearance. Charlie was just gone. His parents moved away the next year. Our family left town soon after, but I never forgot, and I never went near a barn again. Story number 10. The Babysitter's Final Shift. Boston, 1997. The night started like any other babysitting job. The Harpers were a nice couple, a little older than most parents I worked for, but polite. Their son, Max, was 6, small for his age, with big brown eyes that made him look constantly worried. They told me they'd be back late and left me $20 on the kitchen counter. I made Max a peanut butter sandwich, let him watch a little TV, then put him to bed by 8. He didn't complain, just climbed under the covers and stared at me like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. Max hesitated. "If she comes, don't talk to her." A shiver crawled up my arms. "Who?" He pulled the blanket up to his chin. "The lady in the window." I forced a smile. Kids and their imaginations. "No one's going to be in the window, Max. You're safe, okay?" He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. I turned off the light and closed the door, trying to shake off the unease settling in my stomach. Downstairs, I curled up on the couch and flipped through the channels. Static, infomercials, late-night talk shows. I settled on an old movie and let the sounds of the TV fill the quiet house. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Max's number. I frowned. He was supposed to be asleep. I opened the text. "She's here." A chill ran through me. I glanced at the staircase. The house was silent. He had to be messing with me. I typed back, "Go to sleep, Max. No one's there." 3 dots appeared. He was typing. Then, "She's looking at you." My breath caught. Slowly, I turned my head. The window behind the couch reflected the dim glow of the TV. At first, I only saw myself. Then, a shape, a figure, standing just outside. I spun around so fast I nearly fell off the couch. Nothing. The backyard was empty. The wind moved through the trees, the grass swaying in the moonlight. I exhaled, shaking my head, my own reflection. That's all it was. I typed back, "Go to sleep, Max." No response. I checked the time. 11:47 p.m. The Harpers said they'd be back by 1. just over an hour to go. I tried to focus on the movie, but every shadow made my skin prickle. Then, a sound. A creak from upstairs. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The kind of sound a door makes when it's slowly pushed open. Maximum. I grabbed my phone and climbed the stairs, stepping lightly. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by the nightlight, near Max's room. His door was open. I swallowed hard. "Max?" I whispered. No answer. I stepped inside. The bed was empty. The blanket was pulled back, sheets crumpled. The closet door stood slightly ajar. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. I hesitated, then yanked it open. Empty. A rush of air made me whip around. The window? It was open. My breath hitched. I ran to it, heart hammering. No screen, just the dark backyard below. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. A dial tone. Then, static. The line went dead. My stomach dropped. A soft whisper brushed against my ear. "Don't talk to her." I turned so fast I nearly fell. Max stood behind me. His eyes were wide, his face pale. His small hands clutched the edge of his pajama shirt. I let out a shaky breath. "Max, what?" Then I saw it. His lips weren't moving. The whisper hadn't come from him. A sharp creak came from the hallway. The closet door, the one I had left wide open. It was swinging shut. I grabbed Max and ran. Down the stairs, through the living room, straight to the front door. Locked. I fumbled with the chain, my hands shaking too much to get it loose. Then, a knock. Not from the front door. From the window behind me. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't turn around. Max whimpered, pressing his face into my side. The knock came again. Then a voice. Software. Sweet. "Let me in." My hands froze on the chain. I knew that voice. It was my own. I grabbed Max and backed away. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the door unlocked. Not from the inside. The chain slid off on its own. The knob twisted. I didn't wait. I grabbed Max's hand and ran. Out the back door, across the yard, past the trees, into the neighbor's driveway. We pounded on their door. Breathless, desperate. Lights flicked on. Mrs. Dwyer answered in her bathrobe, eyes wide. I couldn't even speak. She let us in. We stayed there until the Harpers came home. They checked the house. Everything was locked. The windows were closed. No sign of forced entry. No footprints outside. Nothing. They didn't believe me. But Max did. When I hugged him goodbye, he whispered, "She wanted you this time." I never went back. Story number 11. The Forgotten Patient of Bellevue Hospital, New York, 2020. I started working the night shift at Bellevue Hospital in early 2020, just as the world was turning upside down. The long hours, the exhausted faces, the beeping machines, it all blurred together. But what I remember most is the silence. Hospitals aren't supposed to be quiet. Not really. There's always some noise. A distant cough, the shuffle of feet, the murmurs of nurses at their stations. But in the East Wing, past the general wards, down the hall near the restricted section, there was a silence that felt wrong. Heavy. That's where I first saw the name. Room 733. I was organizing patient files when I noticed it. An old, yellowing folder, tucked between newer ones. Its label peeling at the edges. Edwin Lancaster, room 733. I frowned. That room was empty, at least as far as I knew. I had never seen anyone go in or out. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped the file open. The papers inside were decades old. The earliest dated back to 1965. notes scribbled in rushed handwriting, medication records long discontinued. But the strangest part? There was no discharge date, no death certificate, no transfer papers. It was as if Edwin Lancaster had simply been forgotten. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision. I turned sharply toward the hallway. Nothing. I exhaled, shaking my head, and closed the file. Maybe it was an old clerical error, a patient long since moved, but something gnawed at me. I needed to see that room. The east wing was mostly dark by that hour. The motion activated lights flickering on as I walked, and the hospital had been partially renovated in the early 2000s, but this section still felt old. The floors scuffed, the walls slightly yellowed with time. Room 7. 33 sat at the very end of the hall. I hesitated, then placed my hand on the doorknob. Cold. Ice cold. I swallowed and turned it. The door creaked open. The room was empty. Mostly. The bed was made, the sheets tucked so tightly it looked untouched. The walls were bare, except for an old metal cabinet in the corner. The air smelled different here, stale, like a place long sealed off. I stepped inside, my shoes barely making a sound against the floor. A gust of cold air brushed past me. I turned, my breath catching. The door had shut behind me. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My pulse quickened. Then I heard it, a wheezing breath. Not mine. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I turned slowly toward the bed. The sheets were no longer smooth. They were pulled back, indented, like someone had just gotten out of it. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the wall. My heart slammed against my ribs. A whisper, so soft, so dry, like paper crumbling. You found me. The light flickered. The metal cabinet in the corner creaked open an inch. I couldn't move. Something shifted inside the cabinet. I wanted to run, but my legs weren't working. The cabinet door swung fully open. Nothing inside. But the whispering grew louder. Not one voice. Many. Muttering. Overlapping. Like a chorus of forgotten prayers. Then, the hospital alarm blared. The lights snapped fully on. And the door burst open. And I nearly fell forward. A nurse stood there, wide-eyed. "What the hell are you doing in here?" she demanded. I swallowed hard, struggling to breathe. But when I turned back, the bed was perfectly made again. The cabinet door was shut, empty. She grabbed my arm and pulled me out. "You're not supposed to be in this part of the hospital," she snapped, leading me down the hall. "That room's been closed for years." I tried to form words. "Why?" She hesitated, then quietly she said, "No one ever left it." I never went near room 733 again, but some nights when I walk past the east wing, I swear I still hear them, whispering. If you made it this far, you're definitely brave enough to handle more terrifying stories. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new horror story. And if you've ever had a chilling experience of your own, share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your horror tales. And before you go, check out the videos appearing on your screen for more spine-chilling stories. Stay safe and keep the lights on.